This is Ranger Sara from Pipe Spring National Monument, and I'm here today to kind of talk to you a little bit about women's rights and honestly sewing. So I know that probably many of you, if you think about it, probably have something that maybe your grandmother made, a bit of embroidery, a crocheted quilt or a crocheted blanket, a quilt, something to that effect. Well, have you ever really, you may not have really thought a lot about these objects in your home, but some of these things really have multiple layers of meaning built into them. If you think about it, needlecraft has been with us for hundreds and hundreds of years. In many ways, a lot of times, especially in the 19th century and before, it was often used to kind of reinforce aspects of the social order, right? A woman was known how neatly she stitched was an indicator of how good of a wife she would be, and so forth. But at the same time, women often use needlecraft as a way to express themselves and as well as a way to challenge parts of the social order, to point out injustices, demand change, and so forth, especially at a time when their voices were limited in the public sphere. It just wasn't socially acceptable to see women parading around in the streets protesting and so forth. And so oftentimes women, when they wanted to point something out, they used their sewing needle. Here today, I am showing what we call the Windor Curtain. Right? So this in many ways is a really good example of someone who created something to serve, to have certain meanings, more than what you're actually seeing here in this curtain that she created. Now, in the 1870s, the United States is gearing up for the centennial, right? They're going to have a huge celebration and exhibitions in Philadelphia in 1876 to mark the occasion. And the years leading up to that, women were being asked across all the states and territories to submit certain items to show in the Women's Exhibition Hall. So this is a huge national audience where women were displaying their skills with a needle. Now, women living out in Utah territory, these were largely women who were following the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these women especially had a bone to pick with how they were being depicted back east. Now, at the time, most people understood that women living out in Utah territory who were following and practicing this religion, many of them were polygamous. And they were plural wives and so forth. And so that understanding led to displays of women in public newspapers being represented like this. So they were often being seen as kind of chattel, being uneducated women who were subject to a radical religion and a radical leadership and so forth. And so these depictions were not exactly very flattering. These women, they wanted to challenge these notions of how they were being represented in these newspapers. And so the head of the Relief Society, Eliza R. Snow, who was also the plural wife of Brigham Young, she sent out a call to all Latter-day Saint women to begin to submit items for the centennial. She wanted to show that the women of Utah, they were real women. They were just as feminine, just as skilled, and just as educated as their counterparts back east. If perhaps, they practiced polygamy or not, it didn't really matter. And so they wanted to have those representations. And so Emmeline Windsor, who is living out here at Pipe Spring at the time, she responds to this call and she creates this curtain. Now, this is made out of linen. She grew the flax right here on the grounds. She processed the linen here, and she spun it into the thread that we see here right in this room, here in the parlor at Windsor Castle. And so in this curtain, she writes out a lot of details. So at the very top, it says 1876. I know it's difficult in the video to see it. You can see there's 2 keys on either side. Now this whole curtain is rife with symbolism. Some of it is part of the Latter-day Saint faith. We can see here at the top keys. Keys were really symbolic within the church, representing the priesthood and so forth, and the spiritual rewards that the faith was giving to folks. Over here there's another key. This might represent the key to the American continent and kind of the idea of this manifest destiny of more territories opening up and coming under the control of the US at the time. We have Windsor Castle knitted out here to show the location of where she created it, and we see the state of Deseret. Now, Deseret was the name that the members of the church actually wanted to call Utah Territory. Deseret has a lot of kind of religious meanings. It means beehive, which you can see right here. And you can see that members of the church saw themselves as busy bees supporting the beehive, the church, the structure of the church, and the state at the time. You can see that there is an American eagle on top with 2 doves underneath its wings as it's perched on the beehive. And so this in many ways is kind of a gentle chiding by Emmeline Windsor. The US and Utah Territory didn't always have the best relations. Even just a few years earlier, Brigham Young, federal officials were attempting to arrest Brigham Young for polygamy, and essentially were trying to unseat the power of the church. And so she's showing here, I think, a hope that there'll be peaceful relationship between the 2 groups, and that the US government, instead of challenging the folks living out in Utah Territory, needed to be protecting it and supporting its people. You can see the flags over here, the American flags. It's kind of meant to represent the patriotism of the people living out here in Utah Territory. Again, we have the year 1876. If you have good eyes, you can make out a couple of the bees flying out of the beehive. Underneath, we have no excellence without labor stitched in there. And that was to kind of represent really kind of the motto of women living out here and the motto of the church at the time, which was nothing is coming out of, you will not get cities and towns if you're not working very hard. But then underneath we also see gloved hands with hearts next to them, kind of representing the fact that the women in Utah, though they were hardworking, they are the center of their families, and they are indeed feminine, real women. And then underneath it says the Centennial Exhibition, and Emmeline Windsor's name is at the very, very bottom. So you can definitely see how women were really using the needle to represent themselves and to make a statement. We see that throughout women's movements in the United States, even into the 20th century. This is a photo showing the women of the National Women's Party. The woman stitching is a woman named Alice Paul, and she is stitching in stars on the National Women's Party's flag to represent each state that ratifies the 19th Amendment. And so sewing was an integral part of both women's voices and expressions of the 19th century and into the 20th century. The suffragists used their sewing to represent both their femininity and also to challenge laws that were barring them from polls and so forth. We can see that they used their needle multiple times. In another photograph, they made costumes to go into parades. You have to remember that, again, it was very in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, women who marched in the streets and who were out walking the streets, well, they were usually before that depicted as prostitutes. And so the fact that you have women who are in leadership roles walking the streets, that was very challenging. And so we can see that women are using their crafts in many ways to challenge all sorts of public notions about themselves. So I hope that this little view of how women have used their needles to change the US essentially has made you rethink that little piece of embroidery you have at home, or that little crocheted blanket or quilt, that there can be a lot of meanings in these items, even through today. If you go on any web page, you can probably find patterns for feminist embroidery or other things for self-expression that women do make today. So it's still a continuing story as we go on into the 21st century. All right, thank you folks. Thank you for joining us here at Pipe Spring.